I'm Haley B. Miller, and this is Ohio Politics Explained, a podcast where you give us 15 minutes and we give you all the news you need to sound smart and impress your friends. Welcome back to Ohio Politics Explained. Today, we're going to dig into the Ohio Senate's proposed budget and a new plan that would transform the state's property tax system. We'll also talk about the future of Ohio's top House Democrat when she leaves leadership at the end of this month. Joining me today is Jessie Balmert.
Thanks for having me.
Our first topic is really the topic of the month, Ohio's two-year budget. The Senate released its plan this week, a couple months after the House passed its version. More changes are on the horizon, but the Senate is expected to vote on it next week. One of the highlights is a $1.1 billion tax cut for wealthy Ohioans. Senate Republicans want everyone to pay a 2.75% tax, except for low-income folks who are not taxed at all. This is something Republicans have wanted to do for a while now, and a lot of people are not happy.
Yeah, it's definitely been a priority of legislative Republicans for a while. It was interesting that this wasn't in the House version of the budget, but it has finally appeared in the Senate version. And when I started covering state government and politics about a decade ago, we had, 5+ brackets. So now this would bring us down to a flat tax if it happens. There's also been a push from Republican gubernatorial candidate Vivek Ramaswamy to get rid of income tax entirely. It does pay for a decent chunk of, what makes state government run. And so that's always the argument against it.
Yeah, one of the big questions, I think, is how Governor Mike DeWine will receive this if it makes it to his desk, because he's been pretty skeptical of more tax cuts. He doesn't believe Ohio needs to do any more to make itself competitive for businesses. He thinks the state's done a good job on that front. And he's kind of like, we got to pay for stuff somehow.
Yeah, you basically summed it up. I would say DeWine didn't propose a income tax cut in his last 2-year budget, but he signed it into law anyway. So we'll see if this becomes a real sticking point. But he has said repeatedly that when he's talking to businesses about coming to Ohio, the income tax rate isn't a real sticking point. Other states that have eliminated their income tax entirely might rely on something like more sales tax or taxes on oil and gas drilling or gambling or so forth. So the money comes from somewhere.
And we do not have Disney World.
We do not.
What are some other things that stood out to you in the Senate plan?
Yeah, so I think there's been a lot of attention on funding for sports stadiums, particularly the Cleveland Browns Stadium in Brook Park. We now have 3 different proposals on how to go for that. So the governor wanted to increase taxes on sports betting. The House wanted to do this bond situation. And now the Senate's grand plan is to take money that's been sitting in this unclaimed fund, $1.7 billion of it, and put aside at least $600 million of that for the Cleveland Browns. So that's certainly interesting.
Yeah, that was a plot twist I don't think anyone expected. And one way that this is different from the House plan, aside from the funding structure, is that it does create an opportunity to pay for other stadium projects down the road. The Bengals have obviously been very public about asking for their piece of the pie. And with essentially half of this only being used for the Browns project, there's another $600 million that could theoretically be used for something else.
Yeah, I know the Bengals, but even FC Cincinnati, there are a surprisingly large number of professional sports teams in Ohio. And I think when you give money to one of them, everyone is going to kind of come with their hands out as well. I think that's why Governor DeWine has been really skeptical of the House version, which focused on the Browns. So I guess we'll see if he likes this idea any better. I know Republicans in the legislature are just not keen on raising taxes. So I think the DeWine's idea is probably dead.
Yeah, that seems that way. Some other things in the Senate budget that stood out to me, it would cut Medicaid by 1% in 2026 and 1.5% in 2027, pretty much across the board. The Senate is also looking at some other ways to save costs in Medicaid, which is concerning a lot of people because, obviously at the federal level, there's a lot of uncertainty about Medicaid funding as well. The Senate wants to do a whole bunch of stuff on property taxes, and we'll talk about that subject in a little bit. But, that's something that has been talked about a lot on this podcast and in general. So we'll see what happens. The Senate's going to pass it next week, and then we'll enter kind of the final phase of the budget process, which is everyone gets together and decides what's most important to them.
Yeah, you really laid it out well. I think conventional wisdom is the big pots of money in state budgets are to educate, medicate, and incarcerate. And so those are, if you're looking for cuts, where you need to take a look at them. A lot of Medicaid is uncertain. The Senate version of the budget keeps this kind of trigger in there that if federal funding for the expansion population drops, that we could just kind of like end that program entirely, which would affect, hundreds of thousands of Ohioans. So there is a lot of concern about what this means at both the federal and state level. And with both budgets happening simultaneously, no one really knows.
Our second topic is House Minority Leader Allison Russo. She announced that she will step down from her leadership post at the end of June once the budget has passed. Russo's name comes up a lot for statewide office, especially since Democrats have a limited bench. Does this mean she's considering her next steps?
Well, Russo didn't say exactly what her next political steps are, but if you were going to be running for a statewide position, this is the step that you would have to take. There are some internal House Democrat policies that you're not supposed to run for higher office while you're also in charge of the caucus. So that's one thing at play, but she's also led the minority caucus in the Ohio House for, several years now. And so we will see what happens next with her. To your point, Democrats don't have a deep bench of people with statewide or, state politics experience. So she's certainly a name that comes up in these conversations.
Yeah. And at this point, everyone is still waiting for former Senator Sherrod Brown to see what he's going to do next. So, Russo has her choosing at this point of, potential positions to run for. The Democratic nominee for governor is going to need a lieutenant governor. There is a Democrat declared for Secretary of State, but a lot of these other races are still basically empty on the Dem side. So, I think they're going to be doing a lot of, as a party, figuring a lot out the next few months.
Yeah, the Democrats are in a weird spot right now because Sherrod Brown takes up so much oxygen in their party, and for good reason. He, narrowly lost the U.S. Senate race when President Donald Trump won the state by 11, 12 percentage points. So he is still considered one of their most viable candidates, and what he decides to do will affect who else decides to run. If you feel like the top of the ticket is going to be strong, or one of the top of the tickets are going to be strong, then you might feel more comfortable getting into one of those down ticket races.
Okay, let's talk about property taxes again. As you all know, lawmakers are throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks when it comes to this. But 2 Republicans unveiled what might be the biggest proposed change yet: getting rid of inside millage. Is this the part where I explain the super sexy topic of property tax mills?
Yes, please.
So under the Ohio Constitution, local governments and schools are basically guaranteed 10 mills of property tax, which is 1% of a property's value. And anything beyond that is what gets voted on the ballot. Lawmakers who introduced this bill said that inside millage is driving a lot of the problems when it comes to property tax increases, because unlike other mills, inside millage will grow if your home value grows. So they're kind of like, let's just do away with it.
Yeah, this is fascinating because inside millage and this concept that a lot of this money goes to schools and local governments and police, this has been kind of a sacred cow in property tax changes. And so the fact that Republicans are really looking at this is interesting, and we'll see where that goes. To your point, it's a lot of money, so that would be a lot of property tax relief, but it also would pretty quickly send these schools and local communities to the ballot box to try to scramble for some sort of alternative.
Yeah, the grand total that House Republicans attached to this was $3.5 billion, and they say the average homeowner would save about $850 on their property taxes, which is definitely not nothing. But schools, local governments are looking at this. We're pretty blindsided by the proposal, I think, and are freaking out a little bit because this would just be such a dramatic change. And counties can levy sales taxes, cities and schools have income taxes, but I think only like a third of school districts have income taxes. So it's not a widely used thing. And I just had a conversation with someone earlier who said it's usually harder to sell an income tax hike to voters. So just a lot of moving pieces.
Yeah, this was interesting. You covered it really well and talked to a bunch of people. It sounds like Republicans are pitching as an alternative. Yeah, like pass an income tax hike, or the alternative is spend less money. And so we'll see how well that's received.
And one more thing before you go. If you're a marijuana user, I have some good news. The Division of Cannabis Control is letting dispensaries increase daily purchase limits to align with possession laws. That means you can buy 2.5 ounces of flower in one trip instead of just one.